Okay, this video is on two important parts of the computer, the CPU and the RAM. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and RAM stands for Random Access Memory. And I'm going to talk about this both in terms of what these things do, and also a little bit of advice on if you're buying a computer or setting up a studio or something, like how you would make some decisions about what to get. So the CPU is essentially the brain of the computer. That's what does the actual calculating work. And the RAM is the random access memory, or I sort of think it as the conscious thought of the computer, the things that you are thinking about at the moment. So pick a piece of information that's stored deep in your brain, but not like in your thought right now, something like your parents' phone number. That information was always there, but when I said that just now, it probably came into your consciousness, right? So that's an equivalent analogy to pulling something into RAM. A good way to think about it is if you've ever had like an old school iPod with the spinning disk drive in it, and you listen to a really long song, sometimes you would feel the iPod spin up in the middle of the song. That meant that the song took up more memory than the RAM in the iPod. So it would load the beginning of the song, and then once it got into the song, it would spin up and offload parts it had already played and bring in new parts, right? So there's data that's stored on the drive, and then there's data that gets pulled into the RAM because it's going to be used at that point in time. So that's a way to think about that. So having more RAM allows us to deal with more things at a given point in time. So when you're purchasing a computer or setting up a machine, the things you want to think about are speed and size. So this particular machine that I'm making this on has a 2.6 gigahertz 6-core Intel Core i7 processor. That's the CPU. And it has 32 gigabytes of 2400 megahertz DDR4 RAM. That's the amount and type of RAM that it has. So the CPU fetches the program instructions, runs the programs. Things that affect how fast a CPU is are the architecture, the clock speed, and the processor bus speed. So the architecture is the actual physical structure of the integrated circuit chip, or you can think of it as the brand of the chip, right? So like an Intel Core i7 has a different architecture than an AMD Athlon chip, which is different than a PowerPC chip. Apple's about to come out, I believe, later in the fall or next year with some new computers running on a different architecture called ARM, ARM, and that's actually going to be, those are going to be manufactured by Apple, I believe. But that'll be an architecture change, so things will change again. Most cores have, or most CPUs have 2 or more cores on a single chip now. So when we talk about speed, that's the time it takes for the CPU to execute an instruction, and it's measured in clock cycles, or cycles per second. So 2 gigahertz means it will do 2 billion instructions in a second. It can flip a bit 2 billion times a second, or flip 2 billion bits in a second, or whatever the case may be. So the processor bus speed, sometimes called front-side bus, is how fast things move around the computer, right? So how fast things can be moved from storage into the RAM, from RAM to the CPU and back, etc. So it's usually the same as the RAM speed. So if you look at the specs, these are different specs from an older machine, but the clock speed of the processor is 2.9 gigahertz. The processor bus, or the RAM speed, is, in this case, was 1867 megahertz. So those two things are the sort of the speed factors. Usually when you're getting RAM, you don't get to choose the speed, like that's built into the motherboard of, like what it takes. And it's usually sort of what's available at the time. Things get faster as time goes on. But we do get to choose how much RAM we select. And when people ask me how much should I get, my answer is usually as much as you can afford. Doing music intensive work, RAM matters a lot. It does, if you're doing video stuff, RAM matters as well, but the processor speed can have a big influence on video because a lot of that rendering uses a lot of processing power. Kind of all of the modern processors are fast enough to deal with most of the audio stuff we will ask it to do. But having more RAM can definitely help your machine perform better in that context.